Welcome everybody to Leadership Lessons with Logan. So today we're going to be studying Jesus and Nehemiah. When studying leadership, specifically for ministry purposes, it is imperative that we look at the Bible and its leaders and not just other Christian leadership models. When looking at the Bible, many leaders stand out to us like Joshua, David, Peter, Paul. The list can go on and on and on. But in today's lesson, we're going to look at two leaders, like I said, Jesus and Nehemiah, and we're going to compare them and see how each of them can help us as leaders. So to start off, what is a leader? What does the Bible say about leadership? Well, the Oxford Dictionary actually defines leadership as the action of leading a group or an organization. While this is true in most cases, leadership is actually much, much more. Bill Gates, a prominent leader, defines it as this. He says, as we look into the next century, leaders will be those who empower others. This seems to be a lot closer to what leadership really is. Now, John Maxwell, a prominent Christian leader, defines leadership as leadership is influence. It's nothing more, nothing less. Now this, again, is close to what leadership is. But the book Lead Like Jesus says this about leadership right on the beginning on page 2. It says, leadership happens anytime we influence the thinking, behavior, or development of another person. This is the closest definition and the one we are going to use for the purpose of this lesson. I think it's something worth noting that each of the other definitions come together to make this cohesive, concise definition of what leadership is. So now that we all have an understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about leadership, let us go back to the Bible and let us look at our first leader today, which is Nehemiah. Now, if you don't know, Nehemiah was called by God to go and rebuild the destroyed walls of Jerusalem. And so he got a call from God on his life to rebuild his home. So Nehemiah, his ancestry is Jewish, and his family was from Jerusalem. And he listened to God, and he went and he rebuilt the wall. So Nehemiah goes to Jerusalem. He starts to build the wall with only a couple of helpers. But he inspires those around him to help build the wall, and the crew rebuilds the wall piece by piece. They work together and accomplish the task together as a team. Nehemiah chapter 4 verse 6 says, at last the wall was complete to half height around the city, for the people had worked with enthusiasm. They worked hard and with passion to complete half the wall with much speed and efficiency. Later, they finished the wall in total of 52 days. And after the wall is complete, Nehemiah does not quit there. He actually goes and starts rebuilding the infrastructure of Jerusalem. He takes a census, he starts empowering other leaders to lead, he elects priests and Levites to lead the people. But Nehemiah does not end there. He actually still continues to lead. And the last couple chapters all talk about how he is reforming Jerusalem to make it better. So now that we have a brief overview of Nehemiah and his leadership, it's time to look at our last leader for today's lesson, which is Jesus. Jesus is the quintessential leader and example of biblical-based leadership. We know the story of Jesus and how he spent years developing his closest friends and his leaders and his disciples into leaders. It took intentional time to be with everyone, even the lower class, and he actually gave them hope. Jesus embodies our definition, which again is leadership happens anytime we influence the thinking, behavior, or development of another person. So you might be asking yourself, why did I choose Nehemiah and Jesus? What do Nehemiah and Jesus share as leaders? What more can we learn from them? Well, there are 6 leadership traits that these leaders share that we Christian leaders should know. So the first leadership trait is empowerment and delegation. Nehemiah knew that he could not possibly rebuild the wall by himself. So he delegated and empowered followers to do the work together. At the start of chapter 7 in Nehemiah, we see that he gives the responsibility of being basically the mayor of Jerusalem to his brother. Nehemiah chapter 7 verse 2 says, I gave the responsibility of governing Jerusalem to my brother Hanai, along with Hananiah, the commander of the fortress, for he was a faithful man who feared God more than most. Jesus also empowered and delegated tasks to his followers. He left Peter in charge of the church after he died. The book, Lead Like Jesus, on page 37, talks about how he left his earthly ministry in good hands after Jesus died. Jesus knew his disciples were in control. Second trait is compassion. Both leaders truly cared for their followers and the people they were leading. Nehemiah cared for his people so much, he was even so far away from them. He was with a king. He wept when he heard the status of the wall in Jerusalem. He cared so much, he even risked his life to the king and to travel there to go and build the wall. And we know that Jesus is actually the ultimate example of compassion because he sent himself to death because he loved us all so much. The third trait is calling. Both Nehemiah and Jesus knew and answered their call from God. Nehemiah answered God's call to go build the wall. He continued to listen to God throughout the entire journey, and he actually also helped people answer their call and respond to God. We saw this in the first trait when he let his brother take control. The verse actually says that his brother feared God more than most. He gave him that opportunity to answer his calling. And Jesus made sure his followers knew their call. He went out and he planned for them to understand their calling. We see that with Peter and James and John. The fourth trait is service or servanthood, being a servant leader. Nehemiah was a servant leader. He went to serve the people in the front lines, not lead from the back. When the people were building the wall and they were threatened, Nehemiah was there with a shovel in one hand and a spear in the other. He protected his people. Jesus served his disciples. He did everything with them. He even washed their feet. He ate with them. He was there on the grounds doing ministry with them. That's servanthood. The fifth trait is confrontation. Nehemiah has a whole chapter devoted to confrontation. He goes and confronts the people trying to stop the wall, and he protects his people who were building the wall. Jesus was the same way. He was often talking and challenging the Pharisees on their point of view to defend his disciples. And neither of them hid from confrontation. They faced it head on to protect their people and their followers. The final trait they share is faithfulness. Both of these leaders were completely trusting in God. Nehemiah went to confront the king because he knew God was going to get him through it. He went and talked to the king, and it says that the king's heart was softened by God. When the wall was attacked, Nehemiah knew God would protect them. He called them all to one place, and God protected them. Jesus was the same way. He knew God would be faithful to him, and he was. Every time Jesus healed somebody, every time a miracle was done, it was because Jesus was faithful. Now, as much as these leaders are alike, they do have differences in their leadership models and styles. And we can actually learn from these differences as well. So the first difference is that Jesus was way more people-oriented and less task-oriented. Jesus spent more time with his followers than Nehemiah did. Jesus built his followers up through relationship, whereas Nehemiah built his leaders through tasks like building the wall. Now, it's not that either of them are completely opposite from each other. They're not polarized. It's just Jesus was more people-oriented. Nehemiah was more task-oriented. Another difference is the time. Jesus had much more time to develop his leaders and his followers. But even with shorter time, Nehemiah still managed to do a great job at developing his followers and leading Jerusalem to be better. Now, the last difference is that Nehemiah was hands-on and more boots on the ground than Jesus. Like I said earlier, Nehemiah was there with a spear in hand to defend the wall from attackers. Whereas Jesus would not have taken up a spear to defend his people, Jesus would have tried to talk it out. He would have sat back and told the disciples to wait. We see this when one of the disciples gets cuts off the ear, right? Jesus wasn't a violent person. He wasn't boots on the ground. He wasn't there. The time difference had shifted. And so that goes to show that leadership has to change with the times. And finally, in the end, both leaders actually give us a good example of what biblical leadership is. This lesson, personally, has taught me a few things about what biblical leadership looks like as well. So one of the first things that this lesson taught me was that biblical leadership is more than just knowing the Bible or knowing the leaders in it. Jesus and Nehemiah knew a ton about the Bible and the Torah, but they actually went out and used it. They didn't just sit in a classroom all day and learned it. They acted on it. The second thing is that faith has to be at the center of what we do for biblical-based leadership. We have to be spiritual leaders leading our followers to be faithful first. If we don't have faith, our followers won't have faith. The final takeaway comes from Nehemiah. Nehemiah was able to inspire his followers to do a challenging task like building a wall. We as leaders today need to inspire our followers like Nehemiah did. If we can get our followers inspired like Nehemiah, imagine what we could accomplish. Overall, Jesus and Nehemiah give us a great leadership lesson on what biblical leadership looks like. They are a truly solid foundation for us all to build our leadership models